Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Future of Work webinar. We'll wait a couple of minutes or just a moment or so for more attendees to join us, and we'll begin shortly. Okay, it's about 11:01 now, and we've got several participants. So we'll kick it off. I wanted to say hello and welcome to everyone this morning. Welcome to the Future of Work webinar series. Today's webinar is Supporting Yourself and Others with Pandemic Stress. I am Michelle Quint, and I'm the Executive Director for Human Resources for UCI Health. I will serve as your MC for this session. This session is one of 6 topics we are offering as we begin to transition back to on-site work and a hybrid work environment. All of these sessions are being recorded, so if you have colleagues who missed today's live session or other sessions, they will be available on the Future of Work website, which we'll go ahead and put in the chat. This is a webinar format, so while you can see our co-hosts and the speaker, we cannot see you, but you'll notice a Q&A box versus a chat box. So feel free to submit your questions during the session, and we'll try to get to as many of them as time allows. So with that, I'm so very pleased to introduce our host for today's session, Dr. Nasim Afsar, the Chief Operating Officer for UCI Health. Dr. Afsar, would you please tell us a little bit about your UCI experience and why this particular session is of interest to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this really critical topic with a phenomenal speaker that we're going to have. I'm Nasim Afsar. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at UCI Health. I've had the privilege of being part of the UCI Health community for the last 3.5 years. Starting off in ambulatory care, and over the past year, I've had the great privilege to serve as the COO for the health system, overseeing our ambulatory and inpatient or hospital-based operations, public safety, building and construction, our patient experience, as well as our clinical and ancillary services. I have to say, I was thrilled to see this topic as an issue that we're going to talk about, and here's why. When COVID started, I realized that for the first time, I really needed to step up differently when it came to my UCI Health family, as well as my family at home. My UCI Health family was under a lot of stress as our COVID numbers were going up in the health system. We did not always have the resources that we needed because of shortages at a national and global level, and we had to come together in very creative, innovative ways to try and problem solve. This led to a lot of resiliency in our teams. It brought out the best in our teams, but at the same time, it put a lot of pressure on us at a time where everyone was struggling with a lot of personal issues. I had colleagues and coworkers who cried because they had loved ones in the ICU or hospitalized with COVID. We had people struggling with balancing the responsibilities at home and at work. And while we had always helped our coworkers manage the stress of what was going on, at no other point in my career have I had everyone in my workforce impacted at the same time. And so that was a different situation that I had to deal with. I would leave very busy days at work for home. I'm a mother of 2 amazing girls, and had to deal with what was going on with 2 kids being on virtual school at home. While kids are adaptable and they also built resiliency, there were a lot of things that they were dealing with at home all the time. And I realized two things in that process. One is as a physician and caregiver, while I had always been in the position of caring for others, I'd never been in the position of caring for so many people at the same time, from people at work, people at home, friends, family. The other one was I was just not very good at taking care of myself and supporting myself. I had to learn as an adult a lot of new skills around how do I ensure that I am cared for so that I can turn around and care for everyone within my work family and home family. And so I was really excited again to see this topic and feel incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Alyson Zalta to join us here to really provide us some best practices around how do we support ourselves and others with pandemic stress. Dr. Alyson Zalta is a clinical psychologist and an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Science and the director of the Trauma and Resilience Lab. Her work focuses on trying to alleviate the mental health burden of trauma by enhancing our understanding of risk and resilience factors that contribute to the development of traumatic stress, and really looking at and exploring some novel interventions for individuals that are affected by trauma. She has received an early career award from the American Psychological Association Trauma Division, and she has received funding from the National Institute of Mental Health and the Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation to support her work. She's recently published several meta-analyses exploring the relationship between social support and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Her current research projects are examining bright morning light as a novel treatment for traumatic stress, and intergenerational transmission of trauma in military families, and experiences of moral injury in frontline nurses during COVID-19. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Zalta, and I really look forward to the presentation. Dr. Zalta.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to be here to get a chance to talk with you all about this really important topic. As you can see right away, we were maybe a little bit optimistic when the title for this talk was originally chosen. We are certainly still all, I think, coping with and learning how to manage the kind of roller coaster that we're on here in the midst of this pandemic. So I'm hoping that today, I know there's a lot of information out there about how to support yourself, what to do to help manage stress. So I'm hoping that perhaps you can take away just one tidbit today. Maybe something will spark your interest, maybe something you'll say, oh, I hadn't really thought of it that way. So my hope is that maybe there's something in here for everyone. As was mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and my expertise is in anxiety and traumatic stress. I am also, oh, let me get this going. There we go. A mother of 6-year-old triplets. I have also tried to figure out how to navigate parenting in this pandemic. So I've also kind of been navigating those challenges. And while I'm going to offer you all hopefully some tips and strategies for how to manage stress yourself, I also really want to emphasize this, how to support others. The reason for this is because in my work, we found that social support is a really important protective factor against all kinds of negative mental health outcomes. So what that means is that you have the opportunity to be a force for good, and we all have the opportunity to create a community of health and really support each other. So I'm hoping I can offer some ideas for that today. So just to get us started, I think this was mentioned kind of in the introduction, but pandemic stress, of course, takes many different forms. There are, of course, workplace challenges, but so many different things that people have had to deal with in the context of this pandemic. And consequently, of course, there's no one size fits all solution for how to manage this because everyone is really dealing with something different. I saw this cartoon posted on one of my friend's Facebook pages, and it really resonated with me because I think that we forget what load we're carrying at this point, right? In terms of just all of our daily demands with kind of this pandemic stress layered on top, and how that means that even small things in our day can suddenly feel really overwhelming and kind of put us over the edge. And I think we forget that for ourselves and think, why am I kind of responding to these things this way? And we also forget that for other people. And so I think I love this little cartoon as a reminder of the many different ways that we're all trying to kind of carry the demands and stressors that this situation has created for us. So one thing I want to start with is that not all stress is bad, right? So everyone experiences stress. Some stress is normal and even helpful. A lot of my graduate school research, I focused on the idea of building mastery and the idea of kind of that which does not kill you makes you stronger, right? So being able to face challenges and grow is actually a really important way to combat stress. And you can see here the idea is that there's kind of an optimal level of stress, right? So you can imagine that when I give my students an exam, if they have absolutely no stress leading up to that exam, they're probably not going to feel very motivated to study or kind of engage in the material, right? So some stress is normal and even helpful, but it's really that excessive stress that leads to breakdown. So you can see when people kind of get into this zone of anxiety and panic and kind of breakdown and burnout. And when I see people kind of in this place of anxiety, what I really think about is this kind of generator of what ifs, right? So I call it the what if monster, but what if this happens? What if that happens? And not in a productive way. So there are times we can say, we can plan, right? And say, if this happens, then I'll do X, Y, or Z. But what anxiety really looks like is kind of those never ending what ifs that never have kind of an answer to them. It's kind of a hope for planning and for managing anxiety, but it actually just kind of spirals. And I've listed here a couple of anxiety myths because I think that people can get really trapped in these cycles because they think that they're worrying about the what ifs in the future is helping them to prepare, is helping them to prevent bad things from happening, or at least protect themselves emotionally when those things happen. And also, we sometimes think that when we worry, it shows that we're caring about other people. But what we find is that if we let these kind of what ifs run amok and kind of without having any check behind it, then really these what ifs don't help people to prepare and don't help to prevent bad things, but it just increases the anxiety and the stress around the situation. And so, what I'm hoping today is I can offer you all a few tips for how to manage when you find that you're kind of on the wrong side of this curve, right? When you're finding yourself kind of leaning towards that fatigue, exhaustion, and even into that anxiety. What do you do? So, the first thing that I wanted to share is that there are things that in our lives that make us more vulnerable to stress, right? Thinking about that original cartoon, there's kind of only so much that we can carry. And so what are the things that make you vulnerable to stress and how do you mitigate those things, right? This can look different for a lot of people, and knowing what are the things that make you particularly vulnerable to stress is really important. Sleep deprivation is a huge one. It is really hard to manage stress when you don't have enough sleep. Now that I'm bridging into sleep research, it has only impressed upon me even more how critical sleep is. And not just getting enough sleep, but the timing of your sleep. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. So making sure that you're getting good sleep. We all know that there are things we're doing like doom scrolling, right? Or perhaps engaging in substances that are likely to make us more vulnerable to stress, yet sometimes feel really compelled to continue to engage in those behaviors. Even something as simple as just hunger, poor nutrition, right? So not taking care of our bodies can make us more vulnerable to stress, as well as isolation and avoidance. So this pandemic has pushed kind of us all in some ways into more of a kind of isolative state. And that's really been, I think we all know how damaging that has been for a lot of people. And so being more isolated can make you more vulnerable to stress. As I mentioned, those social supports are really, really important. And we've all had to figure out how to change the ways in which we engage with our social networks, right? To feel kind of connected to each other. And in terms of avoidance, what we see is that oftentimes as stress builds, people sometimes tend to avoid as a way to try to mitigate that stress. But what happens, of course, is that it doesn't tackle the problem, right? And things grow. So as you avoid things to try to make sure that you don't feel that stress, things kind of accumulate over time. So, so these are some of the things that we see that kind of make people more vulnerable to stress in their day-to-day lives. So I think the first thing to do is to kind of check in with yourself and say, are there any of these things that kind of make me more vulnerable to stress? And how do I try to decrease some of these things so that I can be more kind of robust and ready to handle the stressors that come at me on a day-to-day basis? The next kind of tip that I have is to establish your routine. We know that the pandemic led to a breakdown in routines for almost everyone. A lot of my students, when I taught, told me, I'm having a hard time because now I don't have a reason to really get up in the morning. So I'm going to bed late, I'm waking up late, I'm taking a lot of naps. And, I really have no routine to sit down and study and watch these Zoom lectures, right? So we know that routines are really, really important. And we also know that the return to work is likely to force yet another change in routines. This can be in positive and negative ways. So on the one hand, it helps to reestablish that kind of circadian cycle, right? Where you have a certain time where you're expected to be at work, go home, maybe pick up your kids, etc. At the same time, maybe during the pandemic, you were able to get a workout in the middle of the day because you didn't have to worry about being showered or something like that. So it's possible that your routine is going to have to shift yet again. And we know that routines are really, really, really important for mental health and for maintaining, again, this kind of circadian rhythm, this 24-hour cycle. These routines include a lot of things that often we think of as being in the background. So again, kind of when you go to bed, when you wake up, making sure that you have kind of set times for those things is actually really important and helps to support mental health. Similarly, eating on a routine schedule helps to support your circadian rhythms. So we often think of that light being really important in the morning, but there are other things like eating and physical activity that also help to regulate that internal body clock that's helping you to establish that daily routine. And social interaction as well. So some of my work has really focused on this idea of morning light and the importance of morning light. I'm actually doing a bit of research looking at using wearable devices to do morning light therapy for individuals with traumatic stress to improve mood. And my colleague always says, drive to work without your sunglasses on because that way you're getting the most light in the morning. So it can be small things like this that can help to establish your routine and really help to regulate that circadian cycle that helps to support your mental health. The next kind of strategy and tip that I want to offer is to practice your portable coping tools. And I use the word portable because I think it's really important that we have things that we can kind of carry around in the world with us. Some of you may be really into exercise and some of you may really enjoy baths at night, but when you're sitting in your office, you can't take a bath. So how do you find ways to kind of manage and cope with those stressors that come up during the day? So portable coping tools are really helpful to kind of, especially in brief bursts, to help you alleviate some of that stress. Everybody likes something different. So what I really encourage people to do is to try things out and try it several times to see if you like it. So sometimes you might not like something the first time, but maybe you might like it after you've tried it several times. So this can be things like diaphragmatic breathing, positive imagery, a gratitude journal, listening to nice music, taking a walk, calling a friend, right? So you probably know what's going to work best for you. And it's a matter of carving out really small pockets of time, hopefully, to try to just recenter yourself and focus on the here and now. That what if monster, what it does is it really puts us in the future, right? Trying to guess kind of create a crystal ball to figure out what's going to happen in the future. And the reality is that the future is uncertain. So what these coping strategies really do is help you to kind of come back to the here and now and focus on really simple things like breathing or kind of finding a positive place in your mind. As I mentioned, this is really a trial and error process to figure out what you like. So I never say this is the thing, because there is no one thing that's going to help everyone. So try something out, and then if you don't like it, try something new. That would be my recommendation. Also, one thing I really stress is that it's really important to practice these things when you're not stressed. It may seem counterintuitive, but oftentimes we sometimes go look for help when we're at our most stressed. And that's the time when, we're kind of already in that heightened arousal state. And it's going to be really hard for us to take in new things and new tools when we're in that high arousal state. So practicing when you're kind of in that calm place creates a muscle memory that allows you to take those tools and use them when you're stressed. So what I really encourage folks to do is to find something that they can kind of practice and have with them. And that way, when you kind of experience that stress, it's a go-to and you already have that muscle memory ready to be able to engage with that coping tool, whatever is the one that's right for you. So those are some of my kind of tips and strategies around how to help yourself with stress. Now I want to kind of shift gears and think about, how do I help others with stress? And this is particularly difficult when we think about, hey, I have my own stress. So how do I kind of navigate and manage supporting others? As I mentioned, social support is one of the most important protective factors against mental health problems. But one of the things that I found in my research is that negative forms of social interactions actually weigh much more heavily than positive social interactions. This is kind of true of a lot of things in life, right? We tend to focus on the things that are going wrong sometimes rather than the things going right. But what that means is that when we have these negative social interactions, they can be really potent and actually increase our risk for distress. So that's why I kind of wanted to start with the don'ts, because I think it's really important that we all have an idea of what these are. And before I describe them to you, I want to say these are all things that people do with really good intentions, right? So I think most people have really good intentions when they go to support other people. But we're so eager, I think, to help fix other people's problems that sometimes we can kind of get in the trap of saying something or doing something that doesn't ultimately feel supportive to the other person. So the first don't that I want to share is shoulding all over the person. So this is when we kind of give advice, right, without maybe even asking questions or knowing a whole lot about the situation. So if a friend comes and says, I'm really struggling with my sister, you should just not talk to her. You should cut her out, right? So when we think we're helping, but instead of asking what works for the other person or how they've tried to navigate the situation, we kind of jump in and try to start giving advice right away. And this is something we also sometimes do to ourselves. I want to add, I should be able to manage this situation. I should be able to handle this better. And so really eliminating the shoulds in your life is one, I think, key strategy for supporting yourself and other people. The next is really avoiding minimizing. I think when we do this, the goal is to try to make people feel lighter, right? To lift them up and make it say like, oh, it's not as bad as you think. But what that can really do is invalidate people and their experiences, right? So usually what this looks like is when you say at least. So at least you haven't had to deal with X, Y, and Z, right? So the idea is that you're trying to help people see things from a different perspective. But what that also can do is make people feel like their emotions aren't valid, right? And really what we want people to know is that their experience is valid, even if other people have it worse. So things like, don't worry about it, it's not that big of a problem, right? Those are the kinds of things that, again, we say with the great intention of trying to help support people, but that can really minimize people's experience and make them feel like they aren't being particularly heard. And perhaps some of you even recognize when people have said things like this to you, and it might be good to think about how you felt in those times. And I'll also say that these things aren't always universal, right? It depends a bit about the relationship. But these are kind of general, I think, important strategies for learning how to support others. The next is not to make it all about you, right? So stress is not a competition. I think sometimes when people share their stress, we feel invited to share our own. And sometimes that can be a bonding experience. And sometimes, again, it doesn't allow the other person to kind of have their moment and feel supported. So making sure that we're not saying, oh, well, you should hear what I'm going through, right? And really kind of focusing in on the other individual and letting them have their space is really an important way to support other people. And again, I think people often share their own stressors as a way of trying to bond and connect with the other person and say, you're not alone. But I think there's a way to do that without necessarily making it seem like a competition for who's handling the most stress. And the last kind of don't that I want to share is making assumptions. So as I mentioned, we've all kind of dealt with many different things throughout this pandemic, and we don't know who's dealing with a loss, who's dealing with, various things going on in their lives. And we expect that this pandemic is going to continue to create new stressors and challenges for folks. So I think, being really open to learn about people's experience rather than making assumptions is really critical for supporting others. So those are my don'ts. Now I kind of want to transition over to the do's. So these are the things that we know really help to support people and really make them feel heard and understood. And so the first is really, as I mentioned, validating people's experience. And there are a few things that help people to feel validated. So first is taking the time to actually learn what their experience is like. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you share some news and then somebody has a reaction that suggests that they know how you feel about that experience and they're kind of off, right? So, oh, I got this promotion. They say, that's amazing, but you're feeling really stressed or something like that. So sometimes when we kind of assume other people's emotions without trying to understand their experience, we can kind of miss the boat on being there and helping them to feel kind of supported and understood. When I can share one experience of being pregnant with triplets, you can imagine that there were lots of people who had opinions and thoughts about what that experience was like for me. And when I felt the most supported is when people asked how I was feeling, rather than kind of assuming what that was like for me. So, so taking the time to ask questions is really, really important. And then validating people's emotions, right? So oftentimes what we can do is kind of mimic back the words that people are using, right? Or certainly kind of listen to and try to understand what emotions people are experiencing and sharing that back. So, that must have been really difficult for you. I can understand why you feel so stressed out, given all the things that are going on for you. So just acknowledging that you can understand why somebody is having that emotional experience can feel extremely supportive. And then finally, kind of normalizing people's reactions, right? So I think we've all been a culprit to thinking that we're kind of alone in our kind of experience, and normalizing people's reactions can really do wonders in helping them to feel supported and understood. And so really just sharing, hey, it's natural to experience what you're feeling. Lots of people would feel this way based on what you've shared with me. Those are really kind of important things to hear when you feel like you're alone in your experience. The next, it's really related to validation, but is expressing empathy and caring. One of the things we're going to share in the chat is a wonderful video that I have all of my clinical psychology students watch. And it's a video that describes the difference between sympathy and empathy. And we sometimes get those two things mixed up. And so really the idea of empathy is that we're taking the time to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person, right? So trying to see it from their perspective rather than our own perspective, and staying out of judgment when we do that. This helps us stay away from the shoulding, because when you're inside somebody else's perspective, having our own ideas from our own perspective of what the person should be doing kind of disappears, versus when we really try to see what it's like to step into somebody else's shoes. That can really help us to kind of stay away from that shoulding, and really help us think about what it's like to take that person's perspective, recognize their emotions, and communicate that back to them. I feel like sometimes the easiest way to do this is just to ask, how can I best support you? Rather than assuming that they want problem solving or they want something in particular. Asking people what they need at that moment can really be a powerful way to support someone and show that you care about them. And then finally, building hope. So really, I think it's very important in this time where we all have these moments of, I think, despair over what the future is going to hold. Being able to help create hope that things can get better of time, that people are capable of coping, that they have people who care about them, and that there are ways of getting support when things get kind of tipped too far over that kind of that spectrum that we saw. I think that's really important, that people can kind of see that there's going to be that light in the future, and we can kind of help to build that hope for other people. Not false hope that everything's going to be okay, it's all going to be okay, but that they're capable of coping, that they have people who can support them, and that there are other ways to get some more support if they need it. So finally, I just want to end with, it's really important. You may have some folks who are sharing really mild stressors that they're dealing with, and you may have people who share with you that they're really having in a crisis. And it's really valuable to know what resources are available to you that you can direct people to. There are so many things that are available to us. I'm actually really blown away when I did some digging into the resources that UCI offers. It's really tremendous. There are, of course, the EAP program. There are wellness offerings. There are apps. There are kind of clearinghouses to help you find apps that would be good for you. And of course, there are larger community resources for serious crisis situations. So it's good to be familiar with these resources so that you can offer them to someone when they're kind of experiencing difficulties, and knowing kind of a spectrum of offerings so that you can kind of offer maybe a strategy that would kind of fit with what the person's experiencing in that moment. So those are my, I think with that, oh, there we go. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'd be more than happy, of course, to share, to answer questions and any thoughts that you may have. Thank you so much for coming. And I hope there was, again, maybe one nugget or something that would have been helpful to you all today. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zalta. I got to tell you, I wrote down a ton of different nuggets that I'm taking away from that talk. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I do want to give a huge shout out to you, and one of the members of our audience actually pointed this out. Just a huge kudos. You're such an inspiration for being a professional where you're helping others with all the stressful things that are going on in our environment, and having triplets, which, wow, I got to tell, I can't imagine managing and handling all of that. So again, huge kudos to you, and thank you on behalf of all of us for all the work that you do. We had a question in the chat around, is everyone's circadian rhythm the same? In other words, does everyone's melatonin really start around 11 p.m.?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The answer is no. Everyone's circadian rhythm is a little bit different. So we know, for example, in the literature that there are some folks who tend to be evening types, so more night owls. So going to bed later and waking up a bit later. And there are some people that tend to be the larks, right? So going to bed earlier and waking up earlier. There are kind of DNA markers of kind of what type you are, right? So there are some things that are kind of built in. And of course, there are the social kind of circumstances that push us one way or another, right? So sometimes what our natural clock is not necessarily aligned with what our social clock is. This is particularly true for teenagers, actually, where their social clocks are kind of often wildly misaligned with school start times, right? And this can create actually a lot of fatigue, distress, et cetera. So, so things like morning light can help bring you earlier, right? So if you're having trouble where you find yourself going to bed late and waking up late, light in the evening is going to push you later. So when we're sitting on our devices with all that blue wavelength light, right, that is shifting our clock further back. And actually, interestingly, our internal clocks are regulated to 24.2 hours, which means that we will naturally drift back without light in the morning. So there are really kind of critical things that you can do around sleep hygiene that can help you to regulate that clock. And as I mentioned, light is a big one, but there are also these other things like the timing of eating and exercise and things like that, that as you kind of get into that routine, that will really help to establish that clock and that rhythm that you have. But your clock might be different from somebody else's clock.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for that. We have another great question around, any suggestions for what you tell friends who are sharing negative things with you when you don't have the headspace to really hear or support that?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing. I've certainly had times when I was doing a lot of work as a therapist and felt tapped out for the people in my personal life because of just what I felt like I was carrying emotionally. I think that it's okay to say, I really want to be here to support you, and you're really important to me. And I'm not at my best to support you right now. I think it's okay to acknowledge your own limitations. And I do think it's okay to need space to recharge your own battery. I think being as transparent as you can helps to show rather than just retreating, right? Which is, I think, what sometimes we do is we say, I can't handle this, so I'm just going to retreat. That leaves the person feeling more lonely, more isolated, right? And like you don't care. When really you do care. It's important that you care, but you don't have enough battery, right, to be able to give to that individual. I think it is okay to acknowledge that and to express caring and to say, I wish I could spend more time chatting with you. I wish I could offer you more time. My kids or this or that or work, whatever it might be, is really demanding a lot right now. But seeing, is there something small that you can offer? Perhaps if you can, great. If you can't, it's okay to acknowledge that, right? So I think as much as you can, and I know that depends a little bit on the closeness of the relationship, but I think communicating your boundaries is also a really good way to help people not feel kind of left alone. So if somebody, let's say, is engaging you in a deep conversation, you can say, and you need to get somewhere, right? You can say, hey, this is really important. I'm so glad you were able to share this with me. I am so sorry that I have to go because I really would love to hear more. And maybe we can find another time to chat. I really have to go right now. But I really appreciate your willingness to share this with me. Right. So again, just acknowledging the other person, even if you can't be that support in that moment, is really important and can really help someone. I hope that addresses that question.
That's really helpful. So honesty and communication, and one of the things I'm taking away, kind of sitting back and listening to you, is we've all been in those situations, and you know it's going to come up in the future. It because it doesn't come natural to us, it's perhaps helpful to have some wording around that and develop some comfort around what do we say when, again, we can't really be in that supportive role, but we also don't want to withdraw from people, and perhaps kind of developing some comfort with words that we can use that can be supportive in that moment, but be enabling us to really kind of find the time and space at a later date.
Absolutely. And I think that can also be, getting really comfortable with sharing rather than, do you have time to talk? Sure. As if it's infinite, say, hey, I've got about 10 minutes. Would that be helpful to you? Or do you want to find another time to chat? Right. So again, that transparency, I think, like you said, up front, can be really, really helpful. And I think you're right, kind of practicing sometimes that language, especially if there are some folks that that you're going to maybe get caught up in conversation with, and that can be really tricky for you. I think practicing that a little bit can be really helpful.
That's very helpful. Thank you. We had a question around how do we overcome the avoidance of returning back to work due to the fear of the pandemic and the comfort and safety of that we have from working from home.
Yeah, that's a real challenge, and it's going to look, as I mentioned, a little bit different for everyone. What we know, so it is a balance between taking, of course, proper precautions, right? And we have guidelines, fortunately, to help us figure out what those are. From an anxiety perspective, the more that you do to kind of confront fear, the more fear dissipates, right? So I'm not suggesting, of course, that you kind of run wild and don't worry at all about the pandemic, but rather, deciding what are the things that I'm going to do to make me feel as safe as possible, right? Knowing that there's no perfect certainty in the world. I'm going to follow these guidelines. And then from there, I've made my decisions. I don't have to continue to what if. I've made those decisions. And I think, I don't know about you all, but the decision fatigue is so high, especially with kids. And I've got unvaccinated kids, right? So every tiny time it's like so-and-so wants a play date or this or that, right? You're making a million tiny decisions about risk and safety, and it is exhausting, right? So what I would recommend is that you decide for the office, for example, is you say, okay, this is what I'm going to follow. I'm going to eat lunch at my own desk. I'm going to, right? So whatever those things are that make you feel comfortable, following those, right? And I think, again, finding out what those coping tools are. So if you're just finding that you're kind of acutely in distress because you're feeling really aroused, again, bringing nice music or whatever that portable coping tool is, that's going to help you in that transition so that you're not sitting around kind of what ifing while you're kind of in the office, right? And kind of spinning on that energy that's just going to kind of increase anxiety over time. So those are some of my best helpful tips. But again, it's going to look a little bit different. And if you find that it's overwhelming, I would say reach out and get some support, right? So get some professional support to help you figure out how to navigate these things. Because it can always help to have that kind of separate voice that's not somebody in the office or at home, right, who has some other kind of stake in your decisions, but really kind of that neutral third party that can help you to kind of sort it all out.
Your point about decision fatigue really resonated with me. My two kids are both less than 12 and unvaccinated, and the sheer number of decisions that one has to make for them just to get to be kids is really exhausting. And I hadn't thought about it in terms of decision fatigue, but as soon as you said that, I'm like, that's why I feel so tired. It's already hard enough to be a parent. having to navigate, whether you have vaccinated or unvaccinated children, but having to navigate, how do we keep them safe? How do we keep their emotional well-being on par with what they are doing, academically in schools? There's a lot more decisions to be made today than there was a year and a half ago.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that can feel really hard is I saw an article recently on how we then become somehow internally inconsistent because it's so hard to continue to make consistent decisions, and how that weighs on you, that why am I making this decision here and a different decision there, right? And so yeah, I think we're all kind of trying to figure out how to navigate the fact that recommendations change over time, that the status of the state and case counts changes over time. So how do those things affect our decision making, for us, for the people that we're responsible for? It's a lot. It's a lot. And I think that just acknowledging that that is a burden that you are carrying and the people around you are carrying, I think is really important. And giving yourself a little bit of grace and space to say that this is something else I'm dealing with on top of everything else. And so I need to give myself a little bit of space.
I really appreciate that degree of self-compassion, especially again as whether we are working parents, we're taking care of elderly family members, or we're dealing with just the regular stressors of day to day between our home lives and our work lives. I really appreciate that message of self-compassion and giving us credit for everything that we're dealing with. Yeah, thank you for that. We have a question around, as we're kind of looking at the changing landscape of the pandemic. This, I think, initially in the beginning, we thought was going to be a couple of months. We are a year and a half into it. It looks like we've got other variants, and even while vaccinated, this is still going to be a part of our day-to-day stress for a little while more. Any tips for kind of long-term management of the ongoing stress that we have? Anything kind of different that we talked about as we're looking at the length of time that we're going to continue to be dealing with the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question and a really hard one. I will say, some of the work that I've been doing.
Oh, Dr. Zalta, I think we lost you. Oh, I apologize. It seems like we've got a internet issue with Dr. Zalta's connection. The wonderful thing is that we were able to get through all of our questions as well as her fantastic presentation. There we go. Hi there. We've got you on mute.
Oh, Dr. Zalta, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. I had to switch computers. Speaking of pandemic stress.
I was saying, you kind of left us on a cliffhanger. You said some of the work that I've been doing, and then
wonderful. So yeah, some of the work that I've been doing has been really thinking about the challenges that nurses have been facing during this time, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we've been talking with them about their stories, a lot of language comes up that's similar to things like war, right? And I've also worked with veterans. The interesting thing is that with veterans, there's often a tour of duty, right? So there's kind of a period of time where you anticipate that you're going to be in that environment and that stressor, and then you expect that stressor to end. And what nurses are expressing is that there's this kind of never-ending kind of anticipation of how long this might last, right? So we're definitely hearing that. I think that in terms of how to manage that, right? So I think a lot of us have challenges managing uncertainty. I think we all have a lot of comfort, take a lot of comfort in the things that we feel are really certain in our lives. And so I think that one of the things that sounds just impossible to do, but is important to do in one of these circumstances, is to kind of be willing to live with the uncertainty, right? That we're not going to have that crystal ball. We're not going to know exactly what the future brings. And I realize that's scary and daunting, but I do think that the more that we think we're going to be able to control and predict the future, and then it doesn't meet those expectations, that can create more stress. So I think that I think it's a matter of, again, no perfect solution, really hard question, but with the information you have right now, establish those routines, right? Build those coping tools, and then be willing to flexibly apply what you know. So as things change underneath you, right? As the circumstances change, you have to be willing to change along with them. So it's okay if you create a certain routine, and as things change in the pandemic, that routine has to change, but try to do it as much as you can with intention, right? So, so doing as much as you can to focus on staying in the moment, what works right now, right? And focusing on that rather than what's going to work for me 6 months from now. How am I going to handle it if this continues? We have no idea, right? So really focusing on the here and now, what's going to make life manageable for me right now. And honing in on that and trying to really stay as much as possible in that present moment rather than focusing on the uncertainty of the future, I think is probably the best thing that we can all do. But it's really hard. And I want to acknowledge that, again, there are going to be times when I think everybody kind of falls into that place of worrying about the future and wondering what this pandemic is going to bring us. So I think it's just a matter of trying to center ourselves as much as possible on the here and now.
Wonderful. Well, I am so incredibly grateful for your expertise. I have to say, I wrote down a number of points that I'm taking home tonight for some family conversations. Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you to all our attendees for participating. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Afsar, and thank you, Dr. Zalta. Thank you both for lending your time with us this morning. And again, this is our Future of Work webinar series. We have one more in the series on Tuesday, September 28th. But if you missed any of the series, you can see the topics here. Please go to the website and check out the recordings. Again, thank you all for being here, and we wish you a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.